So the question is there an alternative to this test? Well, there are a few different answers to that. Firstly, this is self-imposed by USS. It doesn't have to be there. It's not required by the regulator. This is just something the USS thought was a good idea. But secondly, I think there's a different way of framing this that captures the essence of the same idea, but is a more sensible way of measuring it. So what would that look like? Well, let's go back to our previous positions. So we had our technical provisions here, and our reliance on covenant that went up to the self-sufficiency valuation there. And similarly here, we had a figure that was technical provisions at year 30 and the self-sufficiency, and hence a reliance on covenant. Okay, my proposal is that you define the reliance on covenant to be the difference between self-sufficiency and the assets of the scheme. So that instead of reliance on covenant being the difference over here, you define it to be the difference over here. Of course, this is a bigger number, but it's still a measure of, in fact, I'd argue it's a better measure of the amount needed to bail out the funds by the employers. What happens when you look at year 30 in that situation? We've got rid of these extras. Well, your reliance on covenant is the same amount at year 30 as it was previously. We're measuring from the top of the self-sufficiency valuation down to the top of this, the assets after the deficit recovery has kicked in. So this is our new reliance on covenant at year 30. Okay, now, why is this better? Well, you can look at whether this amount has increased. You could even look at, if you like, I mean, perhaps an even a better measure would be to go for the difference between self-sufficiency and technical provisions here, inflated and compared to this difference between self-sufficiency and assets at year 30. Okay, so you allow that to increase according to whichever inflation measure you like. But the key point is, if you find it's increased too much, how do you deal with it? Before, we dealt with it by making our scheme more expensive at year 30, by de-risking our investments, which seems like a pretty crazy thing to do to me. Instead, here, you can decrease this amount by just adding in some extra contributions if you like. That will decrease the amount according to the reliance on covenant, and you can get to the same distance away from your self-sufficiency position by doing this. What's the important thing that's different here? Well, your liabilities at year 30 haven't increased because you're still invested in the same productive assets as before. You still have these extras in there. In fact, your scheme is now in a surplus position at year 30. And if we go back to this picture, because you haven't de-risked your assets, you've added nothing to the liabilities at year 0. So the liabilities here haven't increased, and the deficit hasn't gone up to this higher position at year 0. Okay. So what's the key message, in my opinion? I think the de-risking of the scheme is not what anybody really wants. I don't believe it's what employers want. They want good return for their investments, safe but good returns for their investments. You can do that prudently, as they have done in the past, without throwing everything into very safe government bonds. So you don't have this increase in liabilities, you don't have a more expensive scheme, and you do deal with the deficit in a sensible way.